There were no signs. It came without warning. Doom came to us all.
Apollyon is, without a doubt, the most memorable character within For Honor's lore. And while this isn't saying much considering that 99% of the cast is comprised of bland characters with little to no personality, Apollyon still stands on her own as an extremely fascinating and interesting character. And given that much of the community seems to enjoy Apollyon to the point that back in the day many asked for her to be an actual playable character within the roster, a request that likely led to the creation of Warmonger, it seems I'm not the only one who saw something special in her. But what exactly is it about Apollyon that makes her such a memorable and beloved character within the community? Well, given that I already have a history of analyzing seemingly superficial video game campaigns, I think I'm sufficiently up to the task to analyze Apollyon and find out.
I am Apollyon. I bring war.
For context, I think it's best to get Apollyon's origins out of the way to better understand where the character is coming from, but I also believe that her backstory isn't as relevant to the nuances of her character as you would think, something that I will expand upon later, but just keep that in mind. Prior to becoming the antagonist of the game, the woman we now know as Apollyon was once a simple girl, living in a quiet village. One day, word had reached the Iron Legion that a Viking raid would soon be upon them. Due to lack of manpower, a lawbringer named Dante visited young Apollyon's village and declared it unworthy of his protection. When the Viking raid arrived and decimated the village, the soon-to-be Apollyon would be one of the few survivors. This event taught Apollyon something valuable about the world, that one can either be predator or prey. And so she spent the next several years training in combat until she was skilled enough to become a warden. It was then that Apollyon looked for Dante, and upon finding him, she dragged him into the streets and publicly execute him. She would then take his armor and have it refashioned to fit her. Later in her life, Apollyon would also become one of the founding members of the Blackstone Legion, along with 15 other knights, 8 of which would die in their pursuits of becoming warlords amongst the Legion, a task that she would succeed in, and when she did, she would take on the name Apollyon, forever leaving behind the name she once had and the person she used to be. From the outset, it would seem as if this was more than enough to give you an insight into who Apollyon is and why she does the things she does throughout the campaign. However, there is still so much more to discuss when it comes to her character. For instance, her name. You see, the name Apollyon has real-world connotations, with it actually being the Greek version of the name, with the other one being Abaddon, meaning doom or destroyer. In Christianity, it represents a high-ranking demon in Satan's army, or perhaps Satan himself, while in Judaism, it refers to a bottomless pit or a place of destruction. It should also be noted that some interpretations believe that Apollyon was not a demon, but rather an angel of God, and thus, his acts of destruction are that of God's bidding. I bring this up because Apollyon, along with 7 other War Masters of the Blackstone Legion, chose a demonic name to represent what one must become if they wish to change the world. And once you understand the meanings, it's easy to see how the name might have resonated with her specifically. Especially the last one, so keep it in mind as we move forward, as it actually makes a lot of sense when you look at how Apollyon talks about war, as if war itself were a god and she was some sort of missionary spreading the word of God wherever she goes. Huh. I guess that makes the whole crusade meme lore friendly. Of course, all symbolism does is make a character represent something interesting. It's a character's personality that ultimately determines whether or not they will be engaging to the player. And naturally, Apollyon has a well-defined personality. And no, it's not because she's surrounded by bland characters that make her look interesting by comparison. She has a legitimate personality. If I were to describe Apollyon, I would say that she is fierce as well as determined, or simply confident in her beliefs, and while she is ruthless to many, she does show respect to those that she deems admirable warriors. Like how, when confronted with Ragnar, instead of beheading him, she congratulates him for killing 40 of her knights.
Including Davis.
I will remember you.
In fact, even if it's something as simple as promising to rise up and kill her should they be allowed to live, Apollyon sees that killer instinct within the warrior as enough of a reason to respect them and let them continue. And to those that don't understand her point of view, such as the warden, instead of being belligerent, she instead explains her logic in an almost mentor-like way. She never dismisses him, nor does she treat him with any form of contempt. She simply explains herself and tries to show him her logic. Which tells us that despite her love of combat, Apollyon's desire for war isn't out of malice or hatred, but rather because she legitimately believes this is how the world should be. In fact, when listening to every observable in the game, it's clear that Apollyon holds no ill will towards any of the enemy factions, including the Vikings, despite the fact that they're the faction responsible for the destruction of her home. Instead, she views all factions with intrigue and allure more than anything else. And that much is clear by her actions throughout the campaign, where instead of conquering or eliminating the enemy, she opts to kill only the ones who she deems weak, thus ensuring that her adversaries will inevitably grow stronger from this event, a move that baffles most of the soldiers in her army. With all of this, it's safe to say that Apollyon does sort of see herself as a kind of apostle for war itself. From her manner of speaking to her attitudes towards those she considers warriors, it seems that Apollyon's goal is to teach others the way of war and instilling those beliefs onto them, which results in a surprisingly likable antagonist. While Apollyon's beliefs do call for weeding out the weak, which sounds problematic, the weakness in question is not rooted in bigotry as we know it, but rather a person's character and willingness to fight against opposition. And while she does want others to see her point of view, she doesn't really force anyone to join her belief system. She merely shows them what she hopes to accomplish and allows each individual to make up their own minds. After all, even if they end up opposing her, so long as they retain that same desire for combat, that's good enough for her. Of course, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about Catherine Kidd, the voice behind Apollyon, who... Oh my god. I will forever believe that this is what Apollyon looks like underneath the helmet. That is my headcanon. Anyway, appreciation for gorgeous red-headed women aside, Catherine's performance as Apollyon is nothing short of phenomenal. In many respects, a lot of what I said about Apollyon's personality can be attributed solely to her performance. There's a calm demeanor in her voice that makes her sound like a simple mentor trying to instill her values onto her soldier, but with an underlying menace that still communicates that, despite her nuances, Apollon's still the bad guy. I'm also surprised that, despite how good she is, Catherine's filmography is surprisingly short, with the only notable performances being The Outer Worlds and... Well, now that I know that it's Catherine Kidd doing the voice, I think this is the first time I've ever been simultaneously aroused and terrified. Which, given that it's Outlast 2, I think is rather fitting. Lastly, we still haven't touched on what I think is the most intriguing aspect of Apollyon's character: her ultimate goal. In many ways, Apollyon is a very unique villain. For the most part, villains wish to enact some form of change in the world, be it saving humanity from themselves, bringing back a lost loved one, or just good old-fashioned global takeover. However, Apollyon is different in that she doesn't want the world to change. Her entire crusade with the Blackstone Legion is designed to prolong the faction war, to maintain the status quo. Add to that the fact that killing her doesn't really solve anything. After all, Apollyon didn't start the faction war, she grew up in it, just like every other character. So she's simply a byproduct of the world as opposed to an antagonistic force that enacts its will upon it, which really puts things into perspective. When the Orochi claims that all she wants is war, Apollyon clarifies.
All I want is for you to admit what you are. All of you. My wolves.
In real life, Apollyon's views on the world come off as try-hard attempts at being edgy, and that's how a lot of people saw her back in the day. However, in the world of For Honor, her perspective is just a mere observation of the world around her. After all, as I said before, in For Honor, humanity has been fighting for 1,000 years, all without Apollyon's interference. Of course, even in For Honor, Apollyon's view on the world isn't entirely accurate. While the faction war has raged for 1,000 years, this could be due to a number of things outside of humanity's desire for bloodshed. It could be hubris, or perhaps greed, or maybe it's simply the notion that if any faction were to stop now, the deaths of all those that came before them would be in vain. Of course, as centuries pass, more and more people come to the realization that this conflict is senseless, and thus, the faction war was ultimately pointless. So to those capable of casting aside their pride, peace is needed to avoid further loss of life. And I believe Apollyon is very much aware of this fact. Everything she has been taught and all the values she has held for her entire life are being challenged by the current generation who wish to find peace instead of conflict. And as such, what Apollyon wants is for others to acknowledge and come to terms with what she believes is humanity's real purpose. Not necessarily in joining her belief system, but in merely prolonging the faction war. Which makes Apollyon's actions all the more human, as all she's trying to do is preserve her values in an ever-changing world. This also sheds a light on the ending of the campaign. When Holden Cross, Stagander, and Ayu meet to discuss a truce, Holden Cross says,
"We will die in this attempt. You know that. But it would make a worthy tale."
And at first, I didn't know what he meant until I stopped to consider that Apollyon couldn't be the only one. As stated before, war has been raging for 1,000 years. It's only logical that there would be many, like Apollyon, who became accustomed to this way of life and wished to preserve it. And this brings us to year 4. If the warmongers represent anything, it's to embody the wish within that final line delivered by Apollyon. In many respects, seeing her as an Apollyon wannabe isn't just a cheeky way to include Apollyon as a playable character, but rather that the warmongers are simply members of the current generation, sympathizing with the beliefs of those that came before them and wishing to restore those ideals. And so what you have with Season 3 is a social conflict. One being the aforementioned warmongers, and the other one being the Resistance, who are also members of the current generation, but instead fight to move on from those outdated ideals in the hopes of creating a new and better future. Which is an ever-relevant struggle in just about any culture at any point in time. With each passing generation, there will always be those that, through either upbringing or mere interest, wish to preserve old values no matter how outdated they may be, and those that believe that these values must be discarded if society is to ever progress, even against the wishes of those unready to change. Hell, just look at the community and its reaction to the Core Combat update, and you'll find a surprisingly close parallel. Basically, what Ubisoft Montreal has done here is they managed to incorporate an interesting and timeless social struggle into the lore of their multiplayer game, and in a way that not only feels organic but believable. And that's something that I believe deserves to be acknowledged. Of course, all of this wouldn't have been possible without a young girl who believed that the world was comprised of sheep and wolves. All in all, I think that all of these elements are why Apollyon is remembered so fondly within the community. Now, I'm certain that some will accuse me of overanalyzing what is, for all intents and purposes, a pretty mediocre campaign. But I think that the things that have the most impact are the ones worth analyzing. Even if others didn't dissect Apollyon's character as much as I did, there's no denying that she left an impression on those who played the campaign, and that alone says something. It says that there's more to this character than just memes, and that something about her resonated with the players. Whether it's her demeanor, her ideals, or Catherine Kidd's chilling performance, Apollyon managed to leave a mark on us and cemented herself as a character that most of the community can agree is pretty freaking great.